Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. The Serendipitous Encounter. It was a crisp autumn evening, and the streets of Montreal were alight with the soft glow of street lamps. The trees that lined Rue Saint-Denis were a cascade of fiery reds and golds, their leaves swirling in the occasional gust of wind. The city felt alive, yet cocooned in a serene intimacy that made it perfect for wandering souls to cross paths. Sophie hurried down the cobblestone street, clutching a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. Her oversized scarf trailed behind her as she dodged pedestrians, the heels of her boots clicking rhythmically against the stone. She wasn't paying much attention to where she was going. Her mind was still spinning from her last class at Concordia University, where her professor had been particularly relentless in critiquing her creative writing piece. "Too sentimental," he had said. "You need realism. Grit, life isn't a fairy tale." His words stung, not because she didn't agree with them, but because they struck a chord deep within her. Sophie had always been a dreamer, someone who saw the world through a rose-tinted lens, much to the dismay of her more pragmatic friends. Lost in thought, she didn't notice the figure approaching from the opposite direction until it was too late. The collision was gentle but enough to send her coffee cup tumbling to the ground, the lid popping off as the last dregs spilled out. "I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, looking up into the face of her accidental victim. He was tall, with dark, tousled hair that looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. His sharp jawline and deep-set eyes gave him a brooding air, but the slight curve of his lips softened the effect. He wore a worn leather jacket over a plain black t-shirt, and there was a sketchbook tucked under one arm. "No harm done," he said, his voice low and steady. "Are you okay?" Sophie nodded, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "Yeah, I just wasn't looking where I was going." He bent down to pick up her empty cup, his movements fluid and unhurried. "You seem a little distracted," he observed, handing it back to her. "Long day," she admitted. "And now I owe you a coffee." He chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "I think I can survive without it. But how about we call it even if you tell me what's got you so lost in thought?" Sophie hesitated. She didn't make a habit of spilling her troubles to strangers, but something about his easy demeanor made her want to open up. "I'm a writer," she said finally. "Or at least, I'm trying to be one. My professor thinks my stories are too idealistic, and he's probably right, but I just can't bring myself to write anything bleak." The man considered this for a moment. "Why should you? The world has enough darkness as it is. Maybe what it needs is someone who can see the light." Sophie blinked, taken aback by his perspective. "You really think so?" He nodded. "Absolutely. Realism has its place, but so does hope. Don't let someone else's opinion snuff out your voice." She smiled, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. "Thanks. That's exactly what I needed to hear." They stood there for a moment, the city buzzing around them, until he glanced at his watch and sighed. "I have to run, but it was nice talking to you." "Sophie," she supplied. "Nice talking to you, Sophie. I'm Leo." Before she could respond, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving her standing there with her empty cup and a strange sense of longing. For the next week, Sophie found herself thinking about Leo more often than she cared to admit. She began spending more time on Rue Saint-Denis, hoping to bump into him again, but as the days passed, she started to lose hope. It wasn't until the following Friday that she saw him again, this time in a small art gallery tucked away in a quiet corner of the plateau. She had gone in on a whim, drawn by the vibrant abstract pieces displayed in the window, and there he was, standing in front of a large canvas with a familiar sketchbook in his hands. "Leo," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. He turned, his expression shifting from surprise to delight. "Sophie, fancy meeting you here." They spent the next hour wandering the gallery together, their conversation flowing as effortlessly as it had the first time. She learned that he was an artist, recently returned to Montreal after spending a year traveling through Europe. He spoke about his work with a quiet passion that fascinated her, and she found herself opening up to him in ways she never had with anyone else. By the time they left the gallery, the sun had set, and the city was bathed in the soft glow of twilight. They walked side by side, their fingers brushing occasionally, until they reached a small park where a street musician was playing a hauntingly beautiful melody on the violin. "Dance with me," Leo said suddenly, holding out his hand. Sophie hesitated, her cheeks flushing. "I don't know how." "Neither do I," he admitted with a grin. "But who cares?" She laughed, allowing him to pull her into a slow, awkward waltz that somehow felt perfect despite their lack of coordination. For the first time in years, Sophie felt like she was living in one of her own stories. It wasn't until much later, as she was getting ready for bed, that she noticed the folded piece of paper tucked into her pocket. She opened it with trembling hands and read the single line scrawled in Leo's neat handwriting. "I'm sorry I can't stay. Some people are only meant to be chapters in your story, not the whole book." And just like that, he was gone. Chapter 2. Shadows of a Memory. The note weighed heavier on Sophie's heart than she thought possible. She read it over and over again, the words echoing in her mind like a haunting refrain. Some people are only meant to be chapters in your story, not the whole book. It had been 2 weeks since that night in the park, and Leo's absence left a gaping void she couldn't ignore. She tried to fill it with her writing, pouring her emotions into every word, but even her sentences felt hollow. Montreal moved on without her, the city bustling with life and energy that only deepened her sense of isolation. Sophie spent her days at the university, her nights in the solitude of her apartment, and her weekends wandering the streets in vain hope of catching a glimpse of him. But Leo had vanished as if he'd never existed, leaving only the faintest traces behind. A fleeting memory, a fragment of conversation, the ghost of his touch. One particularly cold evening, Sophie found herself in her favorite café on Rue Saint-Denis. The café was cozy and dimly lit, with bookshelves lining the walls and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. She had come here often to write, but tonight her laptop remained closed. Her gaze drifted to the window, where frost clung to the glass in delicate patterns. She tried to imagine what Leo might be doing at that moment. Was he sketching in a hidden corner of the city? Had he left Montreal entirely? "Penny for your thoughts?" The voice startled her. She turned to see a man standing beside her table, holding a steaming cup of tea. He was older, perhaps in his late 30s, with kind eyes and a slightly disheveled appearance. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," he said with a sheepish smile. "You just looked lost." "I'm fine," Sophie replied, forcing a polite smile. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Sophie hesitated, but eventually nodded. The man seemed harmless enough, and a part of her craved the distraction. "I'm Daniel," he said, extending a hand. "Sophie?" She shook his hand, his grip warm and firm. They talked for a while, their conversation meandering from the weather to their favorite spots in the city. Daniel was a journalist, originally from Vancouver, but now based in Montreal. He had an easygoing manner that put Sophie at ease, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was off. It wasn't until he casually mentioned his love for art that her curiosity piqued. "Do you go to galleries often?" Sophie asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. "Sometimes," Daniel replied. "Why do you ask?" "I met someone recently," she said carefully. "An artist. His name was Leo." Daniel's expression shifted, his smile faltering for just a moment before he caught himself. "Leo, huh?" he said, taking a sip of his tea. "Interesting name. What's his last name?" "I don't know," Sophie admitted, feeling a pang of embarrassment. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her. "What if I told you I know a Leo? Tall guy, dark hair, carries a sketchbook everywhere?" Her heart leapt. "That's him. Do you know where he is?" Daniel hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Maybe. But Sophie, if we're talking about the same Leo, you should know something. He's not exactly who you think he is." Sophie's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Leo has a habit of disappearing. People get close to him, and then poof, he's gone. No explanation, no goodbye. Just like that." Her pulse quickened. "Why? Is something wrong with him?" "It's complicated," Daniel said cryptically. "Look, I don't want to scare you, but you might be better off letting this go." Sophie shook her head. "I can't. He meant something to me." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "If you're sure, I can ask around, see if anyone's seen him lately." "Thank you," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. The next morning, Sophie received an email from Daniel with a single line of text. "Meet me at Place des Arts tonight at 8 p.m. I'll explain everything." The cryptic message only fueled her anxiety, but she couldn't ignore the possibility of finding Leo. That evening, she arrived at Place des Arts, the square bustling with performers and onlookers despite the biting cold. She scanned the crowd until she spotted Daniel near the fountain, his hands buried in the pockets of his coat. "I'm glad you came," he said, his breath visible in the frosty air. "Did you find him?" Sophie asked, skipping pleasantries. Daniel nodded, but looked uneasy. "I did. He's staying in an old studio on the edge of Old Montreal. But Sophie, you need to be prepared for what you might find." "What are you talking about?" "Leo isn't just some mysterious artist," Daniel said carefully. "He's been involved in questionable things. People disappear around him, not just metaphorically. I don't know what you mean to him, but be careful." Sophie's mind raced with questions, but before she could ask any, Daniel handed her a slip of paper with an address scribbled on it. "Good luck," he said before disappearing into the crowd. Later that night, Sophie stood outside the address Daniel had given her. The building was old and unassuming, with cracked brick walls and a single dim light above the entrance. Her heart pounded as she climbed the narrow staircase to the third floor, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She hesitated at the door marked 3B, her hand trembling as she raised it to knock. Before she could, the door creaked open. And there stood Leo, his face shadowed but unmistakably him. "Sophie," he said, his voice filled with equal parts surprise and regret. "Why did you leave?" she demanded, her emotions spilling over. Leo sighed, stepping aside to let her in. "You shouldn't be here." But Sophie had come too far to turn back now, and as she stepped into the dimly lit studio, she realized the truth was far more twisted than she could have imagined. Chapter 3: A Canvas of Secrets. The studio was nothing like Sophie had imagined. It wasn't the haven of creativity she'd expected from an artist like Leo. Instead, it felt eerie, almost otherworldly. The walls were bare brick, damp with condensation, and the room was lit only by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and something metallic that made Sophie's stomach churn. In the center of the room stood an easel, its canvas draped with a stained cloth. Around it were scattered sketches, some crumpled, others pinned to the wall. They were chaotic, disturbing, abstract shapes that seemed to twist and writhe, their jagged lines almost painful to look at. "What is this place?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Leo closed the door behind her, his expression unreadable. He looked tired, worn down, as if carrying a weight too heavy for one person to bear. "This is where I work," he said simply. Sophie turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "Why did you leave me that night? Why the note? And why does Daniel think you're dangerous?" At the mention of Daniel, Leo stiffened. "You shouldn't trust him," he said, his tone sharp. "Why not?" Sophie pressed. "He's the only one who helped me find you." Leo ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. "Because Daniel doesn't know the whole story. He thinks he does, but he doesn't." "Then tell me," Sophie demanded, stepping closer. "I deserve to know the truth." For a long moment, Leo said nothing. He seemed to be waging an internal battle, his gaze flickering between the floor and her face. Finally, he sighed, motioning for her to sit on the worn couch against the wall. "This isn't easy to explain," he began, his voice low, "but I'll try." Leo's story was unlike anything Sophie had expected. He spoke of his travels through Europe, how he'd wandered from city to city, always chasing inspiration. But it wasn't just inspiration he was chasing. It was something darker. "There's a reason my art feels off," he admitted, gesturing to the sketches around them. "It's not just imagination. These images come from somewhere real." "What do you mean?" Sophie asked, her pulse quickening. Leo hesitated, then walked to the covered canvas in the center of the room. With a single, deliberate motion, he pulled the cloth away. Sophie gasped. The painting was unlike anything she had ever seen. It depicted a swirling void, dark and endless, filled with distorted faces that seemed to scream silently. The edges of the void bled into a chaotic landscape, where twisted figures writhed in agony. "It's called the Abyss," Leo said quietly, "and it's real." Sophie tore her gaze from the painting, her hands trembling. "What are you talking about? This is just It's just a painting. Leo shook his head. No, it's more than that. I don't just create art. I channel it. The abyss is a place, Sophie. A place where lost souls go. I don't know why, but I've always been connected to it. And when I paint, it bleeds through. That's impossible, Sophie whispered, her mind reeling. I thought so too at first, Leo said. But then I started noticing things. People I painted would disappear. Sometimes they'd show up in my dreams, trapped in that void. And the more I painted, the stronger the connection became. Sophie stood, her legs unsteady. Are you saying you think you're responsible for those people disappearing? I don't know, Leo admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. But I can't risk it anymore. That's why I left you. I couldn't let you get too close. Sophie stared at him, her heart pounding. She wanted to dismiss his words as the ramblings of a tortured artist, but the raw pain in his eyes made it impossible. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. Because you wouldn't stop looking for me, Leo said, his voice breaking. And because I need your help. Leo led her to a small table in the corner of the room where a single photograph lay. It was old and faded, depicting a group of people standing in front of a crumbling church. These are the others, he said, pointing to the photograph. They were like me, connected to the abyss. We met in Prague years ago, trying to understand what was happening to us. But one by one, they disappeared. I'm the only one left. Sophie picked up the photo, her fingers brushing over the faces. What happened to them? I don't know, Leo admitted, but I think the abyss took them, and I'm afraid I'm next. Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. How can I help? Leo met her gaze, his expression desperate. I think you're my anchor. When I'm with you, the connection weakens. It's like you pull me back to reality. Her breath caught in her throat. You mean I could save you? Maybe, Leo said, but it's a risk. The abyss doesn't let go easily, and if it senses you interfering... He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Sophie's mind swirled with fear and doubt, but deep down she knew she couldn't walk away. What do we do? She asked, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. Leo exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time. We find out how to sever the connection, and we start with this. He pointed to the painting of the abyss, its haunting void seeming to pulse with a life of its own. Sophie nodded, her resolve hardening. Let's do it. But as they turned back to the canvas, the air in the room grew cold, and a low, almost imperceptible hum began to vibrate through the walls. The abyss, it seemed, was already watching. Chapter 4. The Abyss Awakens. The humming grew louder, a deep, resonant sound that made Sophie's teeth ache and her chest tighten. She looked around the studio, expecting to see something, anything that could explain the sudden change in the air. Leo, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the vibration. What's happening? Leo was already moving. He grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the painting. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. It's reacting, he said, his voice sharp. It knows we're trying to fight it. What does that even mean? Sophie demanded, her heart pounding. Leo didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a knife from a nearby table, a palette knife stained with dried paint, and turned back to the canvas. I've never tried to destroy one before, he said, his voice trembling. I don't know what will happen. Sophie reached out to stop him. Wait, if this thing is real, what if destroying it makes it worse? Leo froze, the blade hovering inches from the canvas. He looked at her, his jaw clenched. Do you have a better idea? She didn't. Before either of them could decide, the hum became a roar. The light bulb above them flickered wildly before shattering, plunging the room into darkness. Sophie screamed, clutching Leo's arm as the noise swelled, vibrating through her very bones. A cold wind swept through the studio, even though the windows were tightly shut. And then the shadows began to move. At first, they were subtle, shifting across the walls like ripples on water. But as Sophie's eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering in from the hallway, she realized the shadows weren't just moving, they were taking shape. Faces emerged from the darkness, their features twisted and anguished. Hands reached out, clawing at the air, their fingers impossibly long and thin. What are they? Sophie gasped, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. Fragments, Leo said, his voice tight. Pieces of the abyss. They're drawn to the painting. One of the shadowy figures lunged toward Sophie, its hand passing inches from her face. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. "We have to end this," Leo said, his grip on the knife tightening. Sophie grabbed his arm. "If you destroy the painting, could it hurt you? Could it?" "I don't know," Leo snapped, his voice cracking under the pressure. "But I can't let this thing win. Not anymore." Before she could stop him, Leo drove the knife into the center of the painting. The effect was immediate. A deafening scream erupted from the canvas, a sound so raw and primal that Sophie felt her knees buckle. The painting pulsed, its surface rippling like water, as cracks began to spread outward from the blade. The shadows in the room convulsed, their forms distorting and collapsing in on themselves. One by one they dissolved, their anguished faces melting into the air. But the victory was short-lived. The canvas erupted in a burst of light so blinding that Sophie had to shield her eyes. When the light faded, the painting was gone, along with the easel it had rested on. In its place was a gaping black void. It wasn't a metaphorical void, or even an abstract one. It was real, a swirling vortex of darkness that seemed to stretch infinitely inward. The air around it was cold and heavy, pulling at Sophie like an unseen tide. Leo staggered back, his face ashen. No, this wasn't supposed to happen." "What is it?" Sophie asked, her voice shaking. "The abyss," Leo said, his eyes locked on the void. "It's here." The pull of the abyss grew stronger, its swirling depth seeming to whisper incomprehensible words. Sophie felt herself being drawn toward it, her feet sliding across the floor despite her efforts to resist. "Leo!" she cried, reaching for him. He grabbed her hand, anchoring her in place. But his expression was grim, his body straining against the force. "It's too strong," he said through gritted teeth. "We can't fight it." "There has to be a way," Sophie shouted. Leo's gaze flickered to the table where the photograph still lay. His eyes widened as if struck by an idea. "The others," he said. "They knew more about the abyss than I ever did. If we can find out what happened to them, maybe we can stop this." "How?" Sophie asked, clutching his arm as the pull of the void grew stronger. Leo hesitated, his jaw tightening. "There's a ritual, something we tried back in Prague. It requires a tether, something that connects me to this world." Sophie felt her heart sink. "What kind of tether?" Leo looked at her, his expression raw and vulnerable. "You." "What?" "You're my anchor." "Sophie," he said, "if you can hold me here, I might be able to sever the connection to the abyss. But it's dangerous. If it doesn't work, it could pull you in too." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to argue, to tell him there had to be another way. But deep down, she knew there wasn't. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Leo's eyes widened. "Sophie, you don't." "I'm not losing you," she interrupted. "We do this together." He nodded, his expression filled with both gratitude and anguish. The ritual was simple in theory, but terrifying in practice. Leo stood at the edge of the void, his sketchbook in hand. He explained that he would attempt to draw the abyss, using the act of creation to trap it within the pages. Sophie stood behind him, her hands on his shoulders, grounding him. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice trembling, "don't let go." "I won't," she promised. As Leo began to draw, the room seemed to come alive. The whispers from the abyss grew louder, more insistent, and the pull of the void became almost unbearable. The shadows returned, writhing and clawing at the edges of the vortex, their faces contorted with rage. Leo's hand moved frantically across the page, the lines of the abyss taking shape in his sketchbook. "I can feel it," he said through gritted teeth. "It's fighting me." "You can do this," Sophie said, tightening her grip on his shoulders. The pull of the abyss grew stronger, and Sophie felt her feet sliding toward the void. Her fingers dug into Leo's shoulders, her heart pounding as she fought to stay anchored. But then the vortex surged. A shadowy hand shot out from the void, its claw-like fingers wrapping around Sophie's wrist. "Leo," she screamed, her voice filled with terror. He turned, his eyes widening in horror as the hand began to drag her toward the abyss. "No!" Leo shouted, dropping the sketchbook and grabbing her arm. For a moment they were both caught in the pull, their bodies straining against the force. "Sophie," Leo said, his voice breaking. "Let me go. Save yourself." "I'm not leaving you," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. With one final, desperate effort, Leo yanked her free from the shadow's grip, sending them both crashing to the floor. The sketchbook lay open nearby, its pages glowing with an eerie light. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into the air. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the void collapsed in on itself, leaving the room eerily silent. Sophie lay on the floor, gasping for breath. Leo was beside her, his chest rising and falling as he stared at the ceiling. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Leo didn't answer immediately. He turned to look at her, his expression filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "For now," he said. But Sophie knew, deep down, that the abyss wasn't done with them. Not yet. Final chapter. Bound to the abyss. The weeks that followed were eerily calm, the kind of calm that Sophie knew couldn't last. The abyss was gone, or at least no longer manifesting in Leo's studio, but the shadow it cast over their lives remained. Leo had grown quieter, more withdrawn. He spent hours staring at his sketchbook, the pages now filled with haunting depictions of the abyss. Sophie tried to reach him, to remind him of the world beyond his art, but something in him had shifted. One cold evening, Sophie sat on the couch in Leo's studio, her fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. The studio was warmer now, its oppressive chill replaced by a fragile sense of peace. "You've barely spoken today," she said, breaking the silence. Leo looked up from his sketchbook, his eyes hollow but warm when they met hers. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About us," he said, closing the book and setting it aside. "And about what happens next." Sophie's heart sank. She had been dreading this conversation. "I told you before," she said firmly. "I'm not leaving you. Whatever happens, we face it together." Leo smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's what I'm afraid of." She frowned, setting her mug down. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I've been feeling it again, Sophie. The pull. It's weaker now, but it's still there. The abyss isn't done with me." "Then we fight it," she said, her voice resolute. "Just like we did before." "It's not that simple," Leo said, his voice cracking. "The abyss isn't just some force I can resist. It's a part of me. It always has been." Sophie shook her head, refusing to accept his words. "No, you're more than this connection. You're not defined by it." Leo reached out, taking her hand in his. "You're the reason I've lasted this long. But the longer you stay with me, the more danger you're in. I can't let it take you too." "I don't care about the danger," Sophie said, tears welling in her eyes. "I care about you." That night, Sophie stayed in the studio, refusing to leave Leo alone. She fell asleep on the couch, her heart heavy with fear and uncertainty. When she woke, the room was quiet. Too quiet. "Leo?" she called, sitting up. There was no answer. Panic surged through her as she searched the studio, but Leo was gone. The only trace of him was his sketchbook, left open on the table. Sophie's hands trembled as she approached it, her breath catching in her throat. The page showed a familiar image, the abyss, swirling and endless, its edges now tinged with a faint golden light. Beneath the drawing were 4 words written in Leo's shaky handwriting. "I'm keeping it closed." Sophie spent days searching for him, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. She visited every gallery, every cafe, every corner of the city they had shared. But there was no sign of him. Months passed, and though the pain of his absence never fully faded, Sophie began to understand. Leo had made his choice, not to give in to the abyss, but to contain it. She carried his sketchbook with her everywhere, its pages a reminder of their time together and the battle they had fought side by side. One evening, as she walked along the cobblestone streets of old Montreal, a cold breeze swept past her. She stopped, her heart pounding as she turned, half expecting to see Leo standing behind her. But there was no one there, only the faintest whisper, carried on the wind. Some people are only meant to be chapters in your story, not the whole book. Sophie smiled through her tears, clutching the sketchbook to her chest. Leo was gone, but his love and his sacrifice would forever be etched into her soul. And as she walked into the night, she knew one thing for certain: the abyss would never take her. She was stronger now, forged by the shadows of a love that transcended the darkness. Chapter 1. A Serendipitous Encounter. On the first snowfall of December, the streets of Montreal glistened under a soft, silvery glow. The world seemed quieter, the usual bustle of the city muffled by a blanket of white. Claire Hastings walked briskly along St. Catherine Street, clutching her woolen scarf tighter against the biting wind. Her thoughts were a mix of deadlines, gift lists, and a tinge of regret for turning down her coworkers' invitation to a holiday party. She wasn't a fan of such gatherings. Small talk and synthetic cheer were not her style. The city was alive, though. Strangers exchanged fleeting smiles, carolers filled the air with their harmonies, and shop windows shone with intricate displays. Claire stopped momentarily to admire one particularly enchanting setup, an ornate miniature winter village, its tiny streetlights glowing warmly. She traced a gloved finger over the frosted glass, lost in the scene. Beautiful, isn't it? The voice startled her. Turning, she met the deep brown eyes of a man around her age. He was tall, with a rugged charm. Dark curls peeked from beneath his beanie, and a light dusting of snow clung to his shoulders. Claire hesitated before nodding. "It is. Makes you forget the chaos out here, even if just for a moment," he smiled. "Agreed. It's like a world untouched by all this." He gestured around them, where cars honked and pedestrians hurried by. "I'm Ethan," he added, extending a hand. She hesitated but shook it. "Claire." Their handshake lingered just a second longer than necessary. There was an air of spontaneity to Ethan, a disarming warmth that caught her off guard. "Claire, let me guess," he teased. "You're either on your way to a party or avoiding one." Her surprised laugh escaped before she could stop it. "Both, actually. What about you? Just out enjoying the snow?" Ethan shrugged, something like that. "I like seeing the city like this. It's vulnerable, I guess. The snow softens it." Their conversation felt oddly natural, as though they weren't strangers standing on a bustling street corner. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, Claire found herself lingering, enjoying the moment. Ethan had a way of looking at her, as if she were the only thing that mattered in the chaos around them. "Do you like hot chocolate?" he asked abruptly. She blinked, taken aback by the shift. "I mean, who doesn't?" "Perfect." He gestured to a cafe across the street, its windows fogged with warmth and its sign boasting the best hot chocolate in town. "My treat. Unless, of course, you've got somewhere pressing to be." Claire hesitated. She didn't do impulsive. Her life was a meticulous plan, each day an agenda, and yet something about Ethan made her curious. He was a detour she hadn't planned, but found herself willing to take. "All right," she said, surprising even herself. Inside the cafe, the air was filled with the rich aroma of cocoa and the gentle hum of chatter. They claimed a corner table by the window, their hands wrapped around steaming mugs. The conversation flowed easily, weaving between light-hearted banter and deeper revelations. She learned Ethan was an artist, his work an ode to capturing fleeting moments, like the quiet after the first snow. "You're brave," Claire remarked, stirring her drink. "To pursue something so uncertain." "Maybe," Ethan said. "But isn't everything uncertain? I'd rather gamble on something that makes me feel alive." It was the kind of sentiment Claire admired but could never embody. Her own life was ruled by practicality, her dreams shelved long ago in favor of stability. As the evening wore on, the snow outside thickened, and the world beyond their little cafe seemed to blur. For the first time in years, Claire felt unguarded, her usual walls lowered by the warmth of connection. When they finally stepped back into the snow, Ethan turned to her with a lopsided grin. "This was fun. Maybe we could." His words were cut short by the sharp screech of tires. Time seemed to slow as a delivery truck skidded on the icy road, heading straight toward them. Instinctively, Ethan pushed Claire out of the way. She hit the ground hard, the cold biting through her coat as she scrambled to her feet. But the world around her seemed to tilt, her vision narrowing on the scene before her. Ethan lay still, the snow beneath him blooming red. A crowd began to gather, murmurs of shock and concern rising like a tide. Claire's breath came in short gasps as she knelt beside him. His eyes fluttered open briefly, locking onto hers. "Don't forget to live, Claire," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant wail of sirens. And then he was gone. The chaos around her faded into silence. The warmth of the cafe, the sparkle of the window display, the magic of the evening, it all dissolved into an unrelenting cold. Ethan had been a moment, fleeting yet profound, like the snowflakes melting on her gloves. And as Claire stood there, clutching the scarf he had dropped, she realized he had left her with more than just a memory. He had left her with a choice. To keep living as she always had, or to embrace the uncertainty he had so fervently believed in. Chapter 2. The city felt different after that night. For days, Claire drifted through her routines as though in a fog. The world outside seemed harsher, the sharp bite of winter cutting deeper than it ever had. At the cafe where she had shared hot chocolate with Ethan, the staff had placed a small candle in the window. She wondered if they even knew his name. Claire couldn't bring herself to tell anyone what had happened. Her co-workers noticed her quietness but chalked it up to end-of-year exhaustion. She didn't correct them. How could she explain the weight of grief for someone she'd known for only a fleeting evening? And yet, that night had shifted something fundamental in her. She stayed up late one night, searching Ethan's name online. His social media was sparse, mostly images of his artwork, a blend of urban landscapes and soft portraits, each piece imbued with an almost tangible intimacy. There was an email in his profile bio, likely meant for inquiries. On impulse, Claire wrote, "I met Ethan the night of the first snowfall. I don't know if this will reach anyone, but his words left an impact on me. If you were close to him, I'm sorry for your loss." She hovered over the send button for what felt like an eternity before clicking it. Days passed with no response. Claire started to wonder if her message had vanished into the void. But one evening, her inbox lit up with a reply. "Hi, Claire. My name is Julia. I'm Ethan's sister. Your message caught me off guard, but thank you for reaching out. Could we meet? I'd like to hear more about that night." The next afternoon, they met at the same cafe where Claire and Ethan had sat. Julia was strikingly similar to her brother. Same dark curls, same searching eyes. She greeted Claire with a hug, her warmth unexpected but comforting. "Ethan talked about moments," Julia began after they'd settled with their drinks. "He believed that sometimes one moment could change the trajectory of a life. When I read your message, I thought, maybe this is one of those moments." Claire told her everything about the snow, the window display, Ethan's words, and his final act of selflessness. As she spoke, Julia listened intently, her expression a mix of grief and gratitude. "He always saw things in people that they didn't see in themselves," Julia said softly. "It sounds like he saw that in you, too." For the first time, Claire allowed herself to ask the question that had been gnawing at her since that night. Why was he out there? What brought him to that street corner? Julia's lips curved into a faint smile. He had this thing about wandering during the first snowfall. Said it was when the city was at its most honest. She paused, her gaze thoughtful. He didn't talk much about his own life, but he left behind his sketchbooks. They're intense, personal. Something in her tone made Claire pause. "What do you mean?" Julia hesitated before pulling out her phone. She swiped through a few photos before handing it to Claire. The screen displayed a page from one of Ethan's sketchbooks. The drawing was unmistakably Claire, standing in front of the window display, her gloved hand tracing the frost. "I don't understand," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Julia leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "Ethan drew this months ago. He'd never met you, but there you are. He said this girl, you, would be important. That somehow you'd help him finish something he couldn't on his own." The words sent a chill through Claire. I didn't even know him until that night." "Maybe not," Julia said, her eyes searching Claire's face, "but he knew you." Over the next few weeks, Julia shared more of Ethan's sketches. There were more drawings of Claire, each one capturing her in vivid detail. Walking along a snowy street, sitting at a cafe table, staring out a rain-streaked window. They weren't memories, they were predictions. The most unsettling sketch was of a gallery wall. Ethan had drawn several of his own pieces, but in the center there was a blank canvas. Beneath it he'd written a single line, "Only she can fill this." Claire stared at the sketch for a long time, her mind racing. She had never thought of herself as an artist, yet something about the blank canvas called to her. It was as though Ethan had left her not just a challenge, but a purpose. "I think you're meant to finish his collection," Julia said one evening as they pored over Ethan's notebooks. "I don't know how," Claire admitted. "You'll figure it out," Julia replied. "You're already halfway there. He believed in you, even before he met you. Maybe it's time you believed in yourself, too." For weeks, Claire immersed herself in Ethan's world. She visited the places he had drawn, talked to people he had sketched, and slowly began to piece together the fragments of his life. And in doing so, she found herself changing. She started taking risks. Small ones at first, like sharing her thoughts more openly, but soon larger ones, like signing up for a painting class. One crisp evening in late February, Claire stood in front of the blank canvas Ethan had sketched. It was part of a gallery show Julia had organized in his memory. Dozens of people had gathered, each drawn by Ethan's unique perspective on the world. Claire hesitated, brush in hand. The weight of expectation pressed heavily on her. But then she remembered Ethan's words, "Don't forget to live." Taking a deep breath, she made the first stroke. Then another. And another. When she finally stepped back, the crowd was silent. On the canvas was a scene of St. Catherine's Street on the first snowfall of December. In the center stood two figures, a woman tracing frost on a window and a man with dark curls and warm eyes, watching her as though she were the only thing that mattered. The gallery erupted in applause, but Claire barely heard it. She felt lighter, as though she had finally let go of something she hadn't even realized she was holding on to. Ethan had been right. One moment could change everything. And though he was gone, his belief in her had given her the courage to start anew. Chapter 3. The Unfinished Map. Spring crept into Montreal with the faint promise of warmth. The snow receded into the shadows, replaced by blooming flowers and the earthy smell of thawing ground. Life moved forward, as it always did. But for Claire, the rhythm felt different now, more uncertain, yet strangely exhilarating. The gallery show had been a success. Visitors marveled at Ethan's work, and Claire's final painting became the centerpiece of countless conversations. Strangers stopped her to ask about the story behind it, and though she shared bits and pieces, the deeper truth felt too fragile to explain fully. One rainy afternoon, Julia invited Claire over to her apartment. Ethan's old studio occupied the loft, a sunlit room with high ceilings and walls covered in his sketches and notes. Claire had never seen it before, and the sheer intimacy of the space took her breath away. "He spent most of his time up here," Julia said, running her fingers over a table littered with brushes, jars of paint, and half-finished canvases. This was his world. As they sifted through Ethan's belongings, Julia handed Claire a leather-bound journal. It was worn, the edges frayed, but the pages were filled with meticulous sketches and scribbled thoughts. "His personal journal," Julia explained. "I wasn't sure if I should share it, but I think he'd want you to have it." Claire accepted it cautiously, her heart heavy with the weight of the gesture. That evening, back at her apartment, she sat by her window, the journal in her lap. Rain streaked the glass as she opened the cover, her fingers trembling slightly. The first few pages were filled with Ethan's thoughts about his art, frustrations, inspirations, moments of doubt. But as she read on, the entries grew more cryptic. He wrote of vivid dreams, recurring visions of a woman he hadn't met but felt destined to find. "I see her clearly now," one entry read. "She's standing in the snow, her face lit by the glow of a window display. I don't know her name, but I feel like I've always known her. She's the missing piece." Claire's breath caught. He had been dreaming of her long before they'd met. The entries continued, describing encounters that hadn't yet happened, conversations, gestures, even the way Claire had laughed at his joke about avoiding parties. Each detail was uncannily accurate, but one entry, scrawled hastily in the margins, stood out. "She'll find the map. It's incomplete, but she'll know how to finish it." Claire frowned, turning the page, but there was nothing else about the map. The rest of the journal returned to Ethan's usual musings. The next day, she returned to the studio, her mind buzzing with questions. Julia greeted her with a knowing smile. "You found something, didn't you?" Julia asked. Claire nodded. "He mentioned a map. Do you know what that means?" Julia's expression turned thoughtful. "Maybe. There was this old roll of paper he was obsessed with. He called it his map, but it didn't look like one. It was more like a puzzle. He spent hours staring at it, sketching over it, muttering about things not fitting." She led Claire to a storage cabinet, pulling out a cylindrical tube. Inside was a large sheet of parchment, yellowed with age and covered in intricate designs, lines, shapes, and symbols that seemed to dance across the surface. Claire spread it out on the table, her eyes tracing the patterns. At first glance, it seemed abstract, but the longer she looked, the more it felt like something familiar, like a cityscape, fractured and reimagined. "This looks like Montreal," she murmured. Julia leaned closer. "You think so?" Claire nodded, pointing to one section. "Here. This could be Old Montreal, and this St. Catherine Street." Julia's eyes widened. "But why would he call it a map?" "I think it's more than just a map," Claire said slowly. "It's a story. His story." Over the next few weeks, Claire immersed herself in deciphering the map. She visited the locations it seemed to depict, bringing along Ethan's sketches and journal for reference. With each place she visited, she felt closer to him, as though retracing his steps was helping her see the world through his eyes. One day, at a small park near the plateau, Claire noticed something strange. In one corner of the map, Ethan had drawn a spiral pattern that didn't seem to correspond to any landmarks. But at the park, she found a mosaic embedded in the ground, an exact match for the spiral. It was there, sitting on a bench beneath a budding tree, that the realization struck her. The map wasn't just about the places Ethan had loved. It was about connections between people, moments, and the city itself. At the gallery, Claire proposed an idea to Julia. "I want to finish the map," she said. "Not just for Ethan, but for everyone. He saw the world differently, and I think this could help others see it too." With Julia's support, Claire began creating a new piece, a sprawling canvas that combined Ethan's map with her own additions. She included the places she had visited, the people she had met, and the emotions that had shaped her journey. The project took months, but when it was finally complete, it was unveiled at a special exhibit titled The Unfinished Map. The room was packed with visitors, all eager to see the collaboration between two artists who had never truly met, yet had shared a connection deeper than words. As Claire stood by the canvas, answering questions and sharing stories, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Ethan's vision had become hers, and through it, she had discovered a version of herself she never knew existed. Toward the end of the evening, as the crowd began to thin, a man approached her. He was tall, with a kind smile and a camera slung over his shoulder. "I've been following your work," he said. "What you've done here, it's remarkable." Claire smiled, feeling a faint flutter of something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you. It's been quite a journey." The man extended a hand. "I'm Leo. Would you mind if I asked about a certain part of the map? I think I recognize one of the places." As they began to talk, Claire felt a familiar warmth, a spark of possibility. Ethan had taught her to embrace the unexpected, and in that moment, she realized the map wasn't finished after all. It was just the beginning. Chapter 4. Summer had finally arrived in Montreal, though it came quietly, as though still unsure of its place in the world. The city bloomed in shades of green, and the streets once again hummed with the rhythm of life. But for Claire, there was a certain stillness in the air, a feeling that something was on the verge of unfolding. She spent her days working on the unfinished map exhibit, each brushstroke on her canvas becoming a new layer of discovery. The map, though inspired by Ethan's vision, had slowly become her own. Leo, the man she had met at the gallery, had returned several times to speak with her about the project. There was a quiet intensity about him that matched her own, a shared understanding of the unspoken. He was an architect, he told her, and the way she'd interpreted the city's spaces intrigued him. They often met for coffee after her studio hours, discussing everything from design to philosophy, and even the nature of fate. "I can't quite put my finger on it," Leo said one evening as they sat in a small bistro. "But there's something about your work that feels alive, like it's still unfolding." Claire smiled, her eyes tracing the lines of her coffee cup. "It's because it is. Every time I think I'm finished with the map, I realize there's more to see." Leo leaned back, studying her with a thoughtful expression. "It's like you're walking the path with Ethan, not just filling in the gaps he left. You're creating something new, but it feels like it's always been here." For the first time in months, Claire felt a deep sense of connection with someone. Leo was different from Ethan in many ways, but in that moment, Claire realized he was a part of the journey that Ethan had started. The uncertainty of her feelings, the way they seemed to grow with every conversation, was a reflection of the map itself. Unfinished, evolving, but undeniably real. However, just as Claire allowed herself to embrace this new connection, a message arrived from Julia. "I need to talk. It's about the map." Claire's heart tightened. She had been so absorbed in her own work that she hadn't noticed the distance that had slowly grown between her and Julia. She hurried to meet her, the weight of the message hanging over her. Julia was waiting for her in the studio, her face drawn with worry. "I've been going through more of Ethan's things," she said as soon as Claire entered. "I found something I didn't know about." Claire felt a sense of unease settle in her chest. "What is it?" Julia handed her another journal, smaller than the first, its pages filled with a familiar, frantic energy. Claire recognized Ethan's handwriting immediately. The entries were dated months before his death, when he had still been dreaming of Claire. But as she flipped through the pages, something strange began to emerge. "I've seen her again. She's walking through a place I don't know. I can't find it on any map, but I feel it in my bones. It's a place that holds the answers. She's the key, but she doesn't know it yet." Julia paused, watching Claire's reaction carefully. "He started writing about this place. He thought it was connected to the map, but he couldn't find it. He thought it was a dream, or maybe just a feeling." Claire's fingers trembled as she turned the pages, her mind racing. She had always thought the map was about the city, about the streets and buildings. But now she saw that Ethan had been searching for something deeper, something beyond the physical world. A place that wasn't just a location, but a moment in time. A place where everything converged. "The map isn't just about places," Claire said softly, realization dawning. "It's about a journey, a way of seeing the world. Ethan knew that, but he didn't know where it would lead." Julia nodded, her expression conflicted. "There's more. Ethan was convinced that this place, the place he wrote about, wasn't just a metaphor. He believed it existed." Claire stood up, pacing the room, her mind spinning. The feeling in her chest had grown into something urgent, like the map itself was calling her to finish it, to uncover what Ethan had seen. She turned to Julia, her eyes wide with determination. "I need to find this place," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. "The map, it's not finished. Not yet." Julia hesitated, looking torn. "I know, but, Claire, Ethan never found it. How can you?" Claire stopped, taking a deep breath. "I don't know, but I can't stop until I do. Ethan believed in me. He believed that I was the one who could see it, who could finish the map. I have to try." Julia watched her for a long moment, the tension thick in the air. Finally, she nodded, her expression softening. "Then I'll help you. You don't have to do this alone." The next morning, Claire and Julia set out, determined to follow the final trail Ethan had left behind. Armed with the journals, the map, and their shared memories of him, they retraced every step. Through the streets, the parks, the hidden corners of the city Ethan had loved. They visited places he had drawn and written about, looking for any clue that might lead them to the place he had envisioned. Days turned into weeks, and still, the place remained elusive. They began to feel as though they were chasing a shadow, something that existed only in the edges of their minds. But then, one evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Claire found herself standing in front of a building she had passed countless times before. It was old, tucked between two newer structures, and its worn stone facade seemed almost forgotten amidst the modernity of the surrounding area. But something about it felt right. She stepped closer, her fingers tracing the cold stone, and as she did, a memory flashed in her mind, a vision of Ethan, standing in this exact spot, sketching with a look of quiet satisfaction. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is where it ends." Julia stood beside her, her expression unreadable. "It doesn't feel like an ending," she said softly. "It feels like a beginning." And as Claire turned to face her, the truth settled in her heart. The map wasn't a place. It was a path. A journey that didn't end with a location, but with the discovery of something within herself. Something that had always been there, waiting for her to find it. Together, Claire and Julia stepped forward, ready to continue the journey. Not to finish the map, but to let it unfold, one step at a time. Chapter 5. The Final Step. The summer of the search came to a quiet close. Montreal, in its vast beauty, seemed to watch with a knowing silence as Claire and Julia wandered through its labyrinth of streets and dreams. The city itself had become a living, breathing entity, a witness to the quest that had led them here, together, yet forever changed by the journey they had undertaken. Claire often thought back to the early days of her exploration, when the map had seemed like nothing more than a puzzle, a blueprint of a place she wasn't sure existed. But now, standing in front of the old building, she realized it had never been about finding a location at all. The map had been leading her to something much deeper, a place within herself, where everything that had been broken or forgotten could be pieced together. As Claire and Julia stood in front of the building, the realization blossomed. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. The journey had become hers. She wasn't just finishing his story. She was creating her own. "It feels like this is the end," Julia said, her voice soft and reverent. "But I think it's just the beginning of something more. Something we don't fully understand yet." Claire nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The weight of the past, the sadness, the uncertainty, seemed to slip away, replaced by a quiet acceptance. She had been afraid for so long to move forward, but now she knew that it wasn't about moving on. It was about continuing, moving forward with everything she had learned, everything she had uncovered. The building in front of them, worn and weathered by time, had a small plaque on its entrance. Claire stepped closer, her hand tracing the engraving. It was the name of a woman, Marguerite Leclerc, 1897 and 1962. The name seemed to call to her, but there was no clear explanation why. It felt significant, like a whisper from the past. Without saying a word, Claire pushed open the door. The old wood creaked beneath her touch, and as she stepped inside, she felt the air shift. The inside was dark, but there were faint remnants of light filtering through cracked windows. The dust in the air shimmered like particles of forgotten memories. "This place," Claire whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. "I've been here before." Julia frowned, her eyes scanning the room. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Claire murmured, "but it feels like I've seen it, in one of Ethan's sketches." Julia searched the corners of the room. Maybe it's just the memory of him here in this place. He was always so drawn to old, forgotten spaces. Maybe he was searching for something here, too. They walked deeper into the building, and as they moved, Claire noticed something strange. The layout of the space seemed to echo the map Ethan had left behind. The same spiraling pattern from the mosaic, the same curved lines that had felt so familiar before, now seemed to make sense. Every turn, every crevice, every shadow had its place in the map. Every piece had always belonged. Then they found it, an old wooden door at the back of the building. It was cracked open just slightly, as though waiting for someone to find it. Claire's breath caught as she stepped forward, her hand reaching for the door handle. When it opened fully, the room inside revealed a hidden library, filled with rows upon rows of books, their spines faded and curling with age. It was like stepping into a forgotten world, a world that felt both ancient and strangely alive. At the center of the room there was a table, and on it lay a book, its cover worn, its pages yellowed and delicate. Without hesitation, Claire walked up to it. She opened the first page, and there it was, the final piece of Ethan's map, the one he had never been able to finish. But the map was different now. It was no longer a mere blueprint of the city. It was a story, one that intertwined the lives of those who had walked these streets, whose paths had crossed and connected in ways unseen, yet somehow always destined. The map had never been a physical place. It was a record of all the moments, all the connections, all the choices that had led Claire to this point. This is it," Claire whispered, feeling a strange warmth spread through her. The puzzle had been completed. Not with an end, but with a new beginning. Julia stepped beside her, her hand resting gently on Claire's shoulder. "You did it. You found the last piece." Claire nodded, her heart full. But there was something more to be done. Something she had known all along, deep within her. She closed the book carefully and turned to face Julia. "This isn't just for me," she said softly. "It's for everyone who's ever walked this city. It's a story that needs to be shared." And so they made a decision. they would restore the building, turn it into a gallery, the map of moments, where people could come and see the map, feel the connections, and understand that every step taken, every person met, was a part of something greater. As the opening day approached, Claire felt Ethan's presence beside her, not as a ghost, but as a guide. He had left her the map not to finish it, but to pass it on, to show others the beauty of a journey shared. The night of the grand opening, the gallery was alive with people, artists, dreamers, strangers, and friends, each walking through the exhibit, each discovering their own part of the map. And then, just as the evening began to wind down, Claire found herself standing outside, beneath the starlit sky. The first snowflake of the season drifted gently onto her cheek, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to smile. The map had been completed, but the journey was far from over. She could feel it now. The next step was already waiting.